So in this webinar, we are really digging into the nitty-gritty, and we want to talk about how and why athletes should train, in a very hyper-specific individual manner for long course triathlon. And this, well, you'll see it sort of loops back to VLamax, and this is sort of a really important kind of newer master metric that is influencing how the top athletes in the sport train, including, the top athletes and, you know, age group athletes on working triathlete. Um, so to start, we just want to go over energy metabolism at a really high level. And to simplify it, the body produces energy via really three pathways, more or less. Creatine phosphate, which we won't really talk about, but um, the two pathways we do care about, it's the aerobic pathway, which is largely burning fatty acids to create energy, and the anaerobic pathway, which is burning carbohydrates to create energy. And I'll probably use the word ATP a lot. That's the energy currency of cells. So basically, what we want to do is we want to take these substrates like fat or carbohydrate and create ATP so that these electrical impulses can go through our muscles and we can move um, and generate power. And when we think about, it's important to think about aerobic as fat and carbohydrate as anaerobic or without oxygen because of the capacity. So you have a lot of fat. Even athletes who are in the single digits when it relates to body fat, they have a lot of fatty acids to combust to create fuel. Basically limitless stores. Whereas you only have you have a finite amount of carbohydrate stored as glycogen, and you might only have, 300 to 500 grams of carbs stored in your muscles to use. There are carbs in your liver and in your blood and in your muscles, but a limiter as it relates to racing, and when we're doing the math to figure out what somebody can hold for a 70.3 or an Ironman, it relates to glycogen stores and the anticipated depletion of those. Because once they approach zero, you can't sustain your effort.
That's not the right word to use. Launching is
So, and then
doing
we
the
have
car.
in one second, somebody just mute. Just make sure you're on mute if you're not talking. But in long course triathlon, carbohydrates they're the limiter. So in training and racing, our ultimate goal is to go fast while minimizing the amount of carbohydrate you burn at a given intensity so that you can go harder for longer during a race. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts on this very high level overview of metabolism? So if not, I'll just move on. And you might have heard of inside testing, and this is the gold standard at this point in endurance sports as it relates to metabolic profiling. And this is just a screenshot that I took from an inside test. And a powerful insight that you can get at when we do an insight test is we know exactly how much carbohydrate and how much fat you're combusting at a given power output or pace. So this is a cycling test, and the x-axis is watts, and then the y-axis is calorie burn or the grams of fat, which is the green line, and grams of carbohydrate, which is the red line. So you could see as intensity goes up, carbohydrate burn really accelerates quickly. And this athlete, they're a strong athlete, their max lactate steady state or threshold FTP, however you want to think about it, it's right around 300 watts. So it's 296. And you can kind of see as the athlete approaches that number, carbohydrate combustion really goes up quickly, fat combustion really goes down. And this is really why you can't hold, say, threshold for an Ironman. You just burn too much carbohydrate. Consider that if you start with 300 to 500 grams of carbs stored, you can see how, if this athlete at threshold, they're burning 150, they're actually burning more than 150 grams of carbs at that. But, that you can only hold threshold for maybe an hour or 90 minutes, and that largely is due to glycogen depletion. Your body doesn't have carbohydrate to quickly combust carbs to create ATP. Um, so this is a valuable chart because over time we want to push these lines over to the right a little bit. Um, and does anybody have any questions on this chart or any thoughts about sort of carbohydrate versus fat burn? So the reason this is important is because carbohydrate burn is directly related to lactate accumulation in the blood and also acidosis of the blood. So the harder you go, the more carbohydrate you're combusting. A byproduct of combusting carbohydrate is lactate. And your body, what we call sort of the process via which your body breaks down carbohydrates to create ATP, it's called glycolysis. And um, when the body is sort of breaking down carbohydrates to create ATP, an end product, it's basically two pyruvates. And if you have a strong aerobic metabolism, your body can take this pyruvate and, in the presence of oxygen, create ATP. And then otherwise, it's actually pyruvate is turned into lactate and it's your body sort of spits it out into the blood to get it out of the muscle so that your muscle doesn't become acidic. It's okay for your blood to be more acidic. It wants to get it out of the muscle. And then so you have this lactate sort of floating around. So you could see, and this is being created without oxygen. So you can see how lactate relates to carbohydrate combustion. Um, and it's important to remember that lactate is not waste. It's literally, you could think of it basically as half of a sugar molecule kind of floating around in the blood. And your body, once the intensity goes down and it can deliver oxygen to the blood, and if you have a lot of good mitochondrial density, your body can then take this lactate and create ATP out of it. And it's actually the preferred source of energy when there's a lot of lactate in the blood. So it's okay. Lactate is okay. But the reason that I'm talking about all of this is to relate it back to how an athlete should train based on their muscle phenotype. So the question is, okay, why are we measuring lactate? Well, I just sort of described that sort of it's a way for us to quantify actually how much carbohydrate you're burning. And as lactate accumulates in the blood, obviously that correlates with more carbohydrate combustion. Uh, and as lactate accumulates, the associated hydrogen ions will reduce the pH value of the blood. And this is why some people call lactate lactic acid. And, it does contribute. As lactate goes up, you will feel that kind of um, exhaustion, that kind of burning sensation in the muscles. Um, and as blood acidosis occurs, you'll feel muscle fatigue, obviously, um, and you won't be able to put out as much power. And in long course triathlon, obviously, we don't want high lactate concentrations in the blood because it means you're burning too much carbohydrate and you're not exercising efficiently. Um, and we measure this because we care about getting this number, this sort of master metric that I'm going to focus on a lot, and it's VLamax. So VLamax basically measures your how quickly your body is capable, sort of at a maximal effort, of producing lactate. So it's your maximal lactate production rate. And what it is it's sort of a proxy for fast twitch fiber activity. So you might have heard of slow twitch fibers and fast twitch fibers. Slow twitch fibers or type 1 fibers, they're often associated with endurance athletes. They have a lot of mitochondria in them. You can think of them as like really red, blood rich, a lot of mitochondria. And mitochondria is important because that's how your body produces ATP with oxygen. And it's how it burns fatty acids. It's how it basically clears lactate. So you want a lot of mitochondria. And slow twitch fibers have a lot of mitochondria. Fast twitch fibers, they're more glycolytic. So fast twitch fibers will burn. Basically, they're better at generating energy by combusting carbohydrate, which it can produce a lot of ATP quickly, but it's also sort of a dirty way to create energy because your body is taking one of those pyruvates and turning it into lactate and putting it into the blood. Um, so we can figure out your muscle type ratio by figuring out what your VLamax is. So how much lactate are you producing? How much carbohydrate are you producing? And we can test for this. And there are high VLamax athletes and low VLamax athletes. A low VLamax is probably 0.20 millimole of lactate per liter per second. So think about zero point 0.2. And a high VLamax athlete is going to be really anything above zero point 0.6 or zero point 0.7. A really good sprinter is going to, like Usain Bolt, his VLamax is 1.0 or higher. So think about it in that range. Um, and so this is what I'm talking about. When we're talking about how you should train specifically for a long course athlete, and if we're talking about somebody training differently than somebody else, it really relates to muscle phenotype. So how much fast twitch versus slow twitch muscles do you have? What is your VLamax? Again, fast twitch fibers are more glycolytic. They burn a lot of carbohydrate, generate a lot of lactate. If you're a long course athlete, the question is, what do we do? Okay, we want to get mitochondria into those fast twitch fibers, but there is a very unique way that you have to go about doing that if you have a lot of fast twitch fibers. And that's what I'm going to talk about sort of kind of for the rest of this presentation when we'll compare two different athletes, basically a high VLamax athlete who has a VLamax of 0.70 and a low VLamax athlete of 0.25. So does anybody have any questions thus far on anything or comments? I know that some athletes on the call have done the inside test, so um, they kind of peg themselves. I know Sam, you're on the lower end. Sam is a pro triathlete, and he's, on the lower end. That's good. He's built for to be an elite long course athlete. But we do have professionals on the team who are actually pretty darn close to zero point 0.7. Um, the way that you can kind of get around having a high VLA max and still doing well in long course racing is you need a high VO2 max. So you have these three kind of metrics that we're always trying to manipulate to maximize performance on race day. And the three sort of master metrics, VO2 max, VLA max, max lactate steady state, or threshold. And the thing is, athletes can have the same VO2 max. So the two athletes we're going to compare, both of them have a VO2 max of 70 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute. Um, but the difference between these two athletes is their VLA max. So even though they can process the same amount of oxygen, the low VLA max athlete is not going to combust carbohydrates at a super high rate or as high a rate as the high VLA max athletes lower in the power curve. So at lower intensities, even though if these athletes went to the lab and they hooked up to the metabolic cart, the lab technician would be like, your VO2 max is 70, great job. You'll see that these athletes' thresholds, they are much different. And the amount of fat and carbohydrates that these athletes burn at a given power output is so different. And this demonstrates the difference. So this chart basically shows the fuel utilization of the two athletes. So, this green line right here, this represents, fat oxidation of the two athletes. And you can see the low VLA max athlete burns way more fat at lower intensities than the high VLA max athlete. And you can see this carbohydrate combustion curve. This red carbohydrate combustion curve is the VLA, high VLamax athletes combustion curve. You can see how at lower intensities, this athlete, even though they have the same VO2 max, this athlete is burning so much more carbohydrate, generating so much more lactate because the VLA max is high. Those fast twitch muscles are generating a lot of lactate. And then this is the low VLA max athlete. So this low VLA max athlete is efficient. We would call this efficient. So if we were doing an Ironman, this athlete could probably hold in between 200 in between 250 and 300 watts. This athlete, the high VLA max athlete, again, even though his VO2 max is 70, he could probably only hold around 200 watts during an Ironman. That's still a lot of power to hold for an Ironman, don't get me wrong. But again, we're comparing these two athletes. One is way more efficient. And this is the comparison. So this chart is the comparison that really quantifies the difference of what I'm talking about. So these athletes, same VO2 max, the VLA max is different. So the high VLA max athlete at an all-out effort is capable of increasing the lactate concentration of their blood by zero point 0.7 millimole per second. The low VLA max athlete can only increase it by 0.25 millimole. So in a sprint, the high VLA max athlete is going to crush the low VLA max athlete because you can kind of see. So this is a representation of glycolytic power. The high VLA max athlete is going to create a lot of ATP quickly for a short period. Um, the low VLA max athlete simply just literally can't do it. They don't have the capacity. However, the low VLA max athlete is more efficient. So this is their max lactate steady state. You can think of it about it as threshold, FTP, critical power, whatever. It's all really close. LT2, all of those metrics are measuring, getting at the same idea. And the high VLA max athlete, the max lactate steady state is only 294 watts, whereas the high VLA max athlete, the max lactate steady state is 359 watts. So threshold is basically occurring in the high VLA max athlete at 75% of VO2 max, and it's occurring at 92% of VO2 max in the low VLA max athlete. So over time, when you think about this and you apply it to you think about your own fitness level, your VO2 max is going to plateau. And, maybe it takes a year or two of good, consistent training, and then your VO2 max, it becomes more difficult to increase it substantially. But what you can do is you can basically improve your economy and your efficiency and become very efficient within that VO2 max. And I've worked with athletes and their max lactate steady state or threshold is 90% of their VO2 max. That's really high. The average person's, if you just got somebody off the street, it would probably be around 70%. Um, so you can see how efficiency matters. So fat max, the power output at which each of these respective athletes combusts the most amount of fat is a lot different. The low VLA max athlete, 253 watts is fat max. The high VLA max athletes, it's 189. So, this sort of quantifies the difference. Does anybody have any questions on this or thoughts? Nope. So then the question becomes, okay, you have these two different athletes. How should they train differently? Um, and the answer is that it really relates to, you know, in what manner do we incite like mitochondrial biogenesis in the specific muscle fibers of each of these separate athletes? The low VLA max athlete, his he or she has a lot of slow twitch fibers. And the way that a slow twitch fiber responds to training at a given intensity level is actually different than a fast twitch fiber. So in this slide, I'm going to talk about when we're talking about, higher intensity key workouts, how should these athletes train differently in order to get more mitochondria into either the slow twitch fibers or the fast twitch fibers. And The answer is that, and this might be counterintuitive, but the high VLamax athlete actually needs to train at a higher intensity than the low VLamax athlete. So the athlete with a lot of fast twitch fibers, you might think, and if I ask the average person or the average coach, it's like, okay, how should the fast twitch athlete train? The answer might be, oh, needs to avoid high intensity training. Or, it's just a lot of slow training because, we want to build efficiency. That's actually not correct because you have to think about recruitment of the muscles. At lower intensity, your body is really only recruiting slow twitch fibers. And if a high VLamax athlete with a lot of fast twitch fibers wants to get mitochondria into the fast twitch fibers, you need to recruit those fast twitch fibers. And the only way to recruit them without riding for a very, very long time, depleting the glycogen stores, and then recruiting fast twitch fibers just via volume is to go really hard. And so when we're training in a polarized manner or doing a key intensity workout, a high VLA max athlete, we want to target a really high percentage of threshold. I'm talking 120 to 130, even 140% of max lactate steady state. Whereas a slow twitch athlete, they actually can't do that. So it would be very difficult for them to do, say, a VO2 max workout where they're putting out 130% of max lactate steady state. Um, and it's also the case that your slow twitch fibers, they actually don't respond well to super high intensity training in this regard. And I'll show you a chart that quantifies this, and I'll actually do it right now. So, you can kind of see in this chart. So this chart is really why intensity matters and why athletes should be training differently depending on their VLA max or muscle fiber composition distribution. So this chart really shows how each muscle type responds to intensity. So these three lines represent different muscles. And in this study, this is a pretty famous study in the endurance world, and it it basically measured how different muscle fibers respond to different um, high intensity workouts or low intensity workouts. And the y-axis is cytochrome C measurement in the muscle fibers. So cytochrome C, the higher that this level is, it means there was more mitochondrial biogenesis. Cytochrome C is basically it's a protein that lives in the membrane of the mitochondria. So if you measure it over time, the concentration of it, what it's a way to measure mitochondrial density. And then this x-axis is the intensity, and it's basically percent of VO2 max that each group trained at. So, this high intensity group, they did workouts at 116% of VO2 max. Whereas this group, they did workouts at 62% of VO2 max, which is basically like zone two. Um, so you can see each of these lines represents a different muscle. The soleus muscle is a slow twitch muscle. So you can see that as intensity went up, the amount of mitochondria that was created basically goes up until you actually go really high intensity. So as we talked about before, actually the low VLA max athlete, their threshold occurred right around 90% of threshold. So you can see that threshold is probably the best intensity for a really slow twitch dominant athlete to train at. Once they go much harder than it, it's actually training is less effective. And you can kind of see in heavily slow twitch athlete training at a super high intensity, 116%, it can actually detrain you. So it can actually not damage the slow twitch fibers, but over time, it's actually counterproductive to train at an intensity well above threshold for if you want to get mitochondria into slow twitch fibers. Whereas fast twitch fibers, the white vastus, this is a quad muscle, it's basically a straight line up to 116%. So this is why if you're a fast twitch athlete, have a lot of fast twitch fibers, we want to get mitochondria in there. This is why higher intensity training if you only have an hour, say, is important. And I'm talking about very high intensity. Um, so does anybody have any questions on this chart? Again, this might be counterintuitive at this point, but I'll explain why long key endurance sessions are essential and important and valuable for everybody later on. Because I don't want to get across this idea that, okay, you have a high VLA max, everything has to be hard, and that low intensity is counterproductive. But it is the case that if you're a fast twitch athlete going out for an easy ride, it's actually going to benefit you less than somebody who has, a lot of slow twitch fibers, because you could see the cytochrome C concentration um, after these training protocols at various intensity levels. So it's hopefully that makes sense and that kind of clarifies at a pretty granular level what we're talking about. And to harken back to this, so the question is, okay, this is great, Connor, but what does it mean for my training? And the way that we apply this when somebody does an insight test is, depending on what their VLamax is, we end up doing polarized training at a percentage of their VLamax rather than as a percentage of their threshold, which everybody does or any training plan will do. So in the case of these two athletes, both of these two athletes could feasibly be, you know, professional athletes. The high VLamax athlete would be pretty tough. But, you know, what we would do actually is say we're doing 4 by 6 minutes. We might want to target, we would target different percentage of VLA max. So the high VLA max athlete, we would actually want to target 350 watts if we wanted to do something like say 4 by 6 minutes. Whereas the low VLA max athlete would actually target a lower percentage of that. We would target 320 watts. Um, High VLamax athletes, say we were doing a VO2 workout, we would want to target about 375 watts. Low VLamax athlete, we would only target 337. And this sort of makes sense if we look at this chart and consider it. Again, the slow twitch dominant athlete, low VLA max athlete, this is right around threshold, right around here. And you could see that this led to the greatest cytochrome C concentration. There was more mitochondria created if that athlete trains at this intensity versus a slow twitch athlete or a faster twitch athlete. Um, so the master metric ends up being VLA max, basically, for higher intensity workouts. And this quantifies the difference. If these athletes did a 20-minute test or a critical power test, it would return, you know, a certain number, but that's not going to be precise because this high VLA max athlete, for example, could kind of hack a ramp test and it would return a threshold way higher than reality. Um, for 2 by 20, that athlete would be dying. Like if they were doing a 2 by 20 minute effort at threshold, that athlete probably couldn't complete it. Whereas this athlete, if they did the ramp test, it would probably return a max lactate steady state too low. And they would probably not train, hard enough. They would probably not go hard enough during an Ironman. They would probably leave something on the table, whereas this athlete would be the opposite. So this is why actually measuring VLA max and lactate production is better than just doing a test. Does anybody have any questions on this? Nope. So, just considering in this side-by-side comparison, just to elaborate a little bit, again, the high VLA max athlete, they're combusting a lot of carbohydrate, really strong glycolytic system. Low VLA max athlete, really strong oxidative system, a lot of mitochondria, good at burning fatty acids, which requires oxygen and mitochondria to do so. Um, at a given power output, high VLA max athlete is going to be combusting more carbohydrate. They're reducing their glycogen stores faster. Um, Training needs, we need to get mitochondria into the muscle fibers that an athlete has. The way to get those into a fast twitch athlete, if training time is limited, is to go really, really hard. Low VLamax athlete, that could be counterproductive. Um, and then just to talk a little bit about the sprinting phenomenon. So if you're a crit racer, you actually don't want a super low VLamax because you can't sprint. You don't have the glycolytic power to create ATP quickly from carbohydrates. So if a low VLamax athlete wanted to get good at racing crits, we would actually start training more like the fast twitch athlete is training. We'd want to increase VLamax and we would lose efficiency, but we would develop the ability to sprint. Um, so, and when we think about Grand Tour riders, it's like, you know, these cycling teams are constantly trying to manipulate this balance of VLamax versus max lactate steady state, efficiency versus sprintability, depending on what a cyclist needs during a given race. And this just is sort of a visual representation of the metabolic fingerprint. You could see that the VO2 max of both of these athletes are the same. But you can see in this high VLA max athlete, it's really kind of changing their metabolic fingerprint. And it, so it makes a big difference. Um, so we basically already talked about this, but I just want to get across this idea that a one size fits all training approach is not ideal. If you want to really reach your potential, it's good to know what's going on under the hood so that we know what levers to pull. Like at what intensity should you be doing VO2 work or supra threshold work? It for the high VLA max athlete, it's almost certainly better for them to do really short VO2 max intervals, like 20-second, 30-second efforts to make sure that they're putting out power that is, about 10% of their VLA max. And that's going to be really high and might be really hard for them to maintain that for 4 minutes. So for them, we might want to go shorter, but go really, really hard. Whereas a lower VLA max athlete, maybe we don't need to do that, or we just don't target as high an intensity. Um, so we talked about this concept of intensity, and if we're looking to leverage intensity to maximize mitochondrial biogenesis in the muscle fibers. So I didn't talk much about training volume, and everything I talked about thus far maybe is counterintuitive, but this is not going to be counterintuitive. So at the end of the day, if you want to reach your potential, ultimate potential, and sort of cover all of your bases, i.e., develop your fast twitch fibers and your slow twitch fibers, training volume is important and long sessions are valuable for long course racing. No surprise there, but I'll talk about why right now. So, long duration work where, you're riding for 3, 4, 5 hours, depleting your glycogen stores and going for a long period of time can also get mitochondria into those fast twitch fibers. For the first hour or two, maybe there isn't a whole lot going on there. You're not really recruiting your fast twitch fibers during a long, easy ride. But as time goes on, your slower twitch fibers, they're going to be sort of fatigued and you're going to start recruiting your fast twitch fibers at a higher rate. And what's happening is obviously you're stimulating them and your body knows that. So there's all of this cellular signaling that will occur. As glycogen goes down, as slow twitch fibers are fatigued, which happens during a long ride, you're there are a lot of these pathways that are turned on. PGC1 alpha is a main pathway that incites mitochondrial biogenesis. It's a cascade of signaling that tells your body to manufacture more mitochondria. Um, AMP-K goes up as glycogen stores go down. That ratio of ADP to ATP, your body senses it. It triggers this pathway, and you will create more mitochondria. So this is why long rides are important, and it's how you get mitochondria into fast twitch fibers. So high training volume and long training sessions will get mitochondria into your fast twitch fibers as well. Um, and there are various ways to you can kind of accelerate this cellular signaling. You can play around with glycogen depletion a little bit if you're a low volume athlete, but you have to be careful. Work with a coach if you want to do that. And I personally only do that with males and in very specific applications just because of cortisol and you don't want to really start your workouts glycogen depleted. It's very catabolic, basically. But it is a lever to pull with in certain applications. If you have a high VLamax and you're only training 10 hours a week and you want to do well at long course triathlon, it's a potential lever to pull. You can kind of manipulate this and accelerate this um, approach to depleting glycogen, recruiting fast twitch fibers during long rides. There are ways to do it. Maybe you don't take in any carbs for an hour and then you only take in 40 or 50 per hour after that. But you have to do the math. You have to know how many carbohydrates you're combusting at a given power output or throughout the workout. And maybe you want to target, glycogen levels of 40% by the end of the workout. That's typically a good, smart approach that hedges your bets. Um, so the bottom line is that, high training volume builds durability and metabolic flexibility, the ability to combust fat and spare glycogen stores. Um, so this is why volume is good and why key endurance sessions are great for training slow twitch fibers as well as fast twitch fibers. And it can compensate for a lot of sort of inefficient training during the key intensity sessions. Um, does anybody have any questions on this or thoughts? Nope.
Gone through.
Connor, I popped one in the chat.
Oh, okay. What did you ask?
I think if it's relating to this at this point, basically, what percentage of threshold power do high VLamax athletes risk increasing their VLamax during workouts? And then what about athletes with low VLamax? How do they keep that from going up?
Hmm.
Because obviously we all want low VLamaxes if we're doing long course, right? So
Yeah,
what are the general guidelines or percentages for that?
that's a great question. And the answer is actually it has to relate to a percentage of VLA max. And we could do the math. So in general, if you're training at 15% of VLA max or more, you're going to increase VLA max. So the only way to know that, like what that number is to do the insight test. So this is the training zone chart that we customize. So this is the working triathlete training zone chart. And this row here is basically what you're asking. So there is a cap. So this is cap for developing VLA max. If you don't want your VLA max to go up, so this is the low VLA max athlete. This athlete should not put out, he should not go harder than 320 watts. Or sorry, not 300, 372 watts, which is not much harder than his threshold because his threshold is about 350 watts. So this is why this athlete should not be doing work at 130% of his VO2 max because we don't want his VLA max to go up. It's actually, I mean, it's not a huge deal if it goes up. His is really low. But the answer is 372 watts here. And that's about what's 372 over his max lactate steady state, which was just call it it's 359. So it's whatever 359 or whatever that is. 372 over 359 is so it's really low. It's only 104%. Now, this athlete's VLA max is very low. Um, whereas this athlete, the high VLA max athlete, 15% of VLA max is 434 watts. And this athlete's max lactate steady state is 294. So it's 434 divided by what was it? 296. So this athlete can go 147% of his max lactate steady state before his VLA max goes higher. Um, so that's the huge range. So you can't just say athletes shouldn't go over a certain percentage of their threshold if they don't want to increase VLA max. It really depends on what their VLA max is. Um, so that's why this chart is nice. And when I have athletes do inside testing, I generally document what is 7% of VLA max, what is 9%, what is the cap for developing VLA max. And then we just make sure we don't go above it in training. And this is also a reason why, if an athlete is training for an Ironman and they want to go for a ride with roadies and the roadies are training for a crit and they're trying to rip each other's legs off and sprint up hills and draft off of each other, why I get not annoyed, I a little bit annoyed because oftentimes the athletes are increasing their VLA max, which is exactly what we don't want to do as Ironman athletes, because as we just showed when we compared the carbohydrate combustion curve, you become less efficient at lower intensities if you're spending time above 15% VLA max. On the flip side, the athletes I coach who specialize in crits will do 8 by 20 seconds, basically all out, much harder than 15% VLA max, because we want to increase VLA max so that they can put out 1200 watts for a few seconds at the end of a crit. Um, and we care less about max lactate steady state. Max lactate steady states, it needs to be robust enough for them to stay in the pack until the final sprint. Um, but we want to exchange some efficiency for sprint ability. And then, another application is short course racers, athletes specializing in sprint triathlons, draft legal. You don't necessarily you need some power. You need the ability to spend time above threshold, kind of recover and not be toast. And that's why, and you might have to put in surges and increasing VLA max a little bit is okay. A short course sprint triathlete might be okay with VLA max of zero point 0.5 to zero point 0.6. But if that athlete wants to do maximize performance at Ironman, we would train to reduce it. And by reducing it, what I mean is just getting mitochondria into the fast twitch fibers and doing that which uh, gets mitochondria in it in those. But that's a good question. And that's why everybody's different. Like it is helpful to measure this, and we have the ability to measure it. So we literally can measure it directly with via lactate testing in person, and it's just as accurate. We can do it remotely by doing a bunch of max power intervals, essentially. A couple of 20-second all-out efforts, a 3-minute all-out effort, and a 12-minute all-out effort. If we do that, we can we have the software to do it. We partner with Inside to calculate all of these things, and it's pretty cheap. We basically do it at cost for athletes. So um, talk to your coach if you want to do that. Um, if you're a high level athlete and you're putting in some good volume, it's worth it. I mean, it's how you get better and reach the next level. I would say that step one is just training consistently. If you're missing half your workouts, doing this isn't going to matter a whole lot because we just need to get a foundation of fitness. But as soon as you have that foundation, this unlocks a lot of insight and it'll help you train efficiently. The other way this is helpful is it's helpful in understanding what pace you should exert or how much power you should put out during a 70.3 or an Ironman. Because we can do the math. Because, we can assume, a depletion rate of 75 grams an hour of carbohydrate in your glycogen. And then we basically back calculate and like, okay, what power output can this athlete put out during an Ironman that would enable them to finish the race and still have, 15% of their glycogen stores remaining or 20% based on how much they can take in and how much they're burning. And it's one of the most accurate ways to figure out Ironman pace. And um, I've been surprised sometimes I know one athlete, he asked in Slack, he had two questions and we can cover them right now. But one of his questions was, were you ever surprised at the results of an insight test? And, I would say that, usually directionally, we know if an athlete has a high VLA max or low VLA max, but I've definitely been surprised over the years, maybe at some of the lower VLA max athletes, um, because we might test and max lactate steady state is X or critical power is X, but you know a very low VLA max athlete, it's tough to know exactly how low their VLA max is. But there have been athletes with thresholds 50 watts lower than another athlete's, but the lower threshold athlete should be putting out more power in an Ironman. And I have been surprised at the numbers that have been returned, a little bit. I mean, nothing huge, but maybe like a 5 to 10% difference than what I would expect. So this is why it's good to train, and it's very tough. I mean, you have to measure VLA max to know what power you should be putting out for higher intensity intervals to maximally get mitochondria into the muscle fibers that you have. So, I have been somewhat surprised in those things. What other questions? Did anybody post any more? I can't access the chat right now because I'm sharing my screen and I have 70 different tabs open or windows. So I can't figure out how to access the chat right now. That bar is not available. But another athlete asked in Slack, does VLA max change over time as you age? And the answer is two-part. So number one, the way you train will influence VLA max a lot. You can manipulate VLA max depending on how you train, certainly, but in the general population, it is the case that VLA max will go down. Part of that is as you age, there's a lower concentration of enzymes that basically combust carbohydrates, so like PFK and uh, uh, like other enzymes, like different like dehydrogenase, what is it? Glycogen dehydrogenase. They will go down. So your VLA max will go down a little bit, and it'll go down, say, faster. Those enzymes will go down faster than the enzymes that you're basically that combust fats. So like the enzymes that you use to generate ATP by combusting fatty acids, those enzymes will be remain high. So, but it's not like there'll be these massive swings over time, but it is interesting to think about, as we age, the differences and these changes. And this is one reason potentially why we see athletes continue to perform well at long course racing and in ultras as they age. Because your aerobic metabolism can remain robust so long as you use it. It's use it or lose it. So when we think, I talked a little bit about race day implications in these regards. So, a high VLA max athlete, they're not going to be able to put out as much power as a low VLA max athlete, because they're going to be combusting carbohydrates at a higher rate at lower intensities. So there's a higher risk of glycogen depletion. So we need to target a lower percentage of VO2 max if your VLA max is high compared to if you had a low VLA max, largely because of mitochondrial density and slow twitch versus fast twitch composition.
Hey, Conrad, how often would you recommend like retesting, or if somebody's gotten that testing done and they know their VLA max what's a good time frame to say, okay, let's see if it's gotten lower or change or what?
So you can manipulate these metrics over different time frames. It will depend on training volume, of course. So a pro triathlete training 25 hours a week has greater ability to manipulate, say, their VLamax or alter the mitochondrial density of their fast twitch fibers because they just train more. So the cellular signaling, the frequency is more frequent and more robust. So, you know, I've seen solid swings in a couple of months. You're not going to dramatically reduce your VLA max in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but every 8 weeks is a good. Like it would be great if every athlete could do an inside test every 8 weeks. These are not cheap. Um, so 8 weeks is a good frequency. I would say that's the highest frequency that it would be worth testing. Um, Quarterly is great. Uh, 2 times a year is also great. If you're going to do that, then you kind of want to do it, I would argue, sort of in the middle of the off season after you lay a foundation of fitness after your final race. And then you sort of get the baseline, and it's like, okay, what's my metabolic footprint? What can I do right now over the next few months to change it? And normally, this is okay, what do we do to reduce VLA max in the off season right now? How do we make your fast twitch fibers look more like slow twitch fibers? That's usually the approach that we're talking about. For low VLA max athletes, it's like it doesn't, there are fewer levers to pull. And with these athletes, we care less about, you know, carbohydrate control. We care, it's, there's less manipulation of VLA max that we're trying to do with these athletes. It's good to know what they are, but these athletes, once we get to this point, there are massive swings in metrics, but with these athletes, it's good to test frequently. This year, I mean, an athlete comes to mind, we were able to reduce it by about zero point 0.2, um, from like close to 8, zero point 0.8 to zero point 0.6, basically. And that was with basically doing exactly what I've been talking about. Um, and there have been, so that kind of movement is possible. Um, but it would be tough to improve your VLA max beyond that, and you might not even want to. Um, so, so my answers are at most every 8 weeks. Quarterly is great, so call it every 12, 13 weeks, and then at minimum, middle of the off season, and then somewhere in the build, say 8 to 10 weeks out of your A race is good. I like that mainly because it gives us some guidance on targeting, like with John. We did this right before your Ironman build. So it's like, okay, if the Ironman was tomorrow, we would target this power. And if we want to train at Ironman pace, we need to be training here. And, over the next 8 weeks, we'll probably reduce VLA max a little bit. Ironman pace will be a little bit harder, but we need some guidance on how to train, say, in the first half of the build. Um, so I like off-season training for understanding where VLA max is, and then right before the main build, that race-specific build, assessing again so that we understand what carbohydrate burn is at given power outputs, so we can just train at race pace. It's just a good way to assess fitness. And the idea is during the race specific block, you can do invisible monitoring. Every key endurance session you look at, and if it's 4 by 30 minutes at 70.3 pace,
New
the
waiting line.
question is, what pace did you hit? How did you feel there? You start just looking at performance during the workouts to kind of dial in race pace after that. But it would be great to do an inside test pretty close to an Ironman also, or 70.3, say a month out, because then you kind of get a new snapshot. The issue with that is that's also kind of like the critical load period, and you're going to be carrying fatigue. So, this is just one data point and it needs to be taken in the context of like the global training plan, fatigue, etc.
For the higher VLamax athletes, would you say that there's an increased risk of injury because of the higher intensity sessions, or no?
For running, there would be. For cycling, if they have a good bike fit and the workouts are reasonable. So the load certainly has to relate to what the athlete can withstand. And I will say that, you know, there have been studies done that look into this. Athletes who are low have a low VLA max and a lot of slow twitch fibers, they can recover better from workouts, so they can withstand a higher training volume. And part of this is the talent we talk about when we talk about pro athletes. It's like how how can this athlete recover so well? Well, they actually have a lot of slow twitch fibers, smaller fibers, blood rich. Um, they can, like in studies where volume and load has been controlled, same, normalizing for VO₂max and fitness, athletes with a more fast twitch dominant phenotype, like the markers of recovery or inflammation, like creatine kinase, etc., it's higher in fast twitch dominant athletes. So it is the case that lower VLA max athletes usually can actually withstand a higher overall training volume and load. So we do want to be careful with throwing a bunch of volume at fast twitch dominant athletes. That doesn't mean they can't recover. It's just relatively speaking, you bring up a good point. We need to consider the impact of training and volume. But the fact is, fast twitch dominant athletes, it's usually tougher for them to deal with high volume, but they're usually pretty good at getting through and recovering from higher intensity work. Um, but we definitely want to be careful when we're doing high intensity work, especially well above threshold, for sure. But that's a good question and a good point.
Conrad, you don't have to go into detail on this if you don't want to, because I think it might open up a can of worms. But how does heat relate to substrate utilization and like lactate production?
The hotter the temperature, the more carbohydrate you're going to burn. We know that lactate production goes up, and part of it is just the temperature of the muscles, but also you have to consider dehydration and an inability of delivering oxygen to the working muscles. If that's occurring, then your anaerobic metabolism is going to become more involved, and anaerobic metabolism equals carbohydrate combustion equals lactate production. So, yeah, this is why we have to reduce target pace in heat. Um, because temperature itself will increase carbohydrate consumption, so core body temp, and also the consequences of like the peripheral consequences, which is reduced plasma volume because you're sweating a lot. Um, so
So
the
just get
other, and the other, it's a double-edged sword because we also know that as core body temp goes up, your ability to absorb exogenous carbohydrate and fluid, like the gels you're taking in, and the fluid you're drinking, absorption is reduced. So that's why we have to be careful in hot racing. And it's why preparing for hot races is so important. So do your sauna protocol and train in conditions that you're going to race in so that your body gets used to it. Um, so, so
so
you can
just
say, I guess you can kind of think about it in terms of like, yeah, you're in theory, I guess your VLA max won't go up, but your carbohydrate combustion curve will look more like that of somebody who has a higher VLA max in the heat. It's not like you'll be able to produce more because that's limited by like enzymes and the cytosol of your muscle fibers, your muscle cells. Any other questions?
Yeah, hey Conrad. With the VLamax test, particularly with the inside testing, I think you typically do it on the bike. What's the concepts around doing it with running, and or the guidelines and principles of percentages the same in like to threshold and so on in running as it is in cycling in this?
You can do inside testing with running. You go to the track, and I've done it a bunch, and you basically measure out the distance, and you do it in the same manner, basically. And you can get at a VLA max. If VLA max run versus cycling, it's a little bit different often. It depends on the athlete, but directionally, if you have a VLA max cycling, you're going to have a high VLA max running. And it's nice to know. I will say it's the reason that we emphasize cycling is because you can just tolerate more cycling load and your cycling volume is higher, so you can manipulate these with greater precision. A lot of times with running, you're just limited by the number of miles you can run. But the principles are still the same as it relates to manipulating VLA max. It's like, you know, you don't want to be doing a bunch of 100-meter sprints if you want to
No,
reduce your VLA max.
how are
Um,
you?
for if you want to reduce VLA max, long runs are great. Long runs with hills, that's the ultimate. The classic Lydiard workout, long run, and just don't shy away from the hills. So everybody locally, we need to see more people at the Percy Warner Park runs.
Not much sleep.
Everybody shows up to Pancake Flat, Shelby Bottom runs, but usually they're the same, and we can measure it.
Fuck, yeah.
Like, we think about a 800-meter runner. So Cole Hawker, he just won the world champs in the 5K, an American guy, and he probably has a pretty high VLA max. Athletes who can kick really well, it's correlated with a higher VLA max because they're producing a lot of power quickly. Um, so this is why in tactical races it opens up the
You
field.
learning in terms of work. Just work.
So,
Work. Yeah.
what else? Any other questions? But so, I mean, if you want to do inside testing, reach out to your coach. Um, Again, we offer it, and it can offer some pretty good insight into how you should be training. So hopefully this was useful. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask them on Slack. But it was good seeing everybody, and I think we have some sort of wrapping up the season. Good luck in any of the races that you have left. And the off season is a good time again to test these, to do an inside test and understand what's going on under the hood. All right, guys. Well, good seeing everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Conrad.
Yep,
Hey,
Thanks.
Connor, thanks.
sure thing. Bye-bye.